Copa, our amended Copa program proposal. This is our 12th public general meeting since late 2021. And in addition, we had 17 formal meetings during 2021 for much of the year, where we worked together in two different teams to co-create a proposal that meets the many diverse interests, we hope, that would be affected by this proposal. So we are happy to have you with us tonight. We are going to present focusing on the changes in the proposal, and because we think most of you are familiar with it, and then leave half of the meeting for time for your questions and comments. So the questions come up: does staff support this proposal, and will we give kind of a neutral assessment to the City Council when it's time to bring it forward? And the answer is staff believes that this program could help make a difference to stabilize some of our residents that are subject to displacement. And that is why we have been working on it since 2020. And we are glad to be back actively working on this and moving it forward this spring. However, our job is to give all sides of the issue to the City Council. So we'll be listening to your feedback tonight, as always, and reflecting back the pros and the cons and the different constituents' thoughts on this. So with that, we think this amended proposal tonight will be familiar to some of you, but we'll try to both present as if folks are not familiar with it, but still go quickly through and focus on the changes. Okay, with that, I will hand it over to Elizabeth, and she will get us started.
Thank you. We're going to get our interpretation started. First, we're going to have an announcement from our Cantonese interpreters. Ching, I think you were going to make an announcement about Cantonese interpretation.
Yes, I could not mute myself.
Okay.
Mute myself. Okay. 大家好，我哋今日會提供廣東話翻譯嘅服務。咁因為咧，我哋 Zoom 咧係冇辦法選擇廣東話嘅。咁一陣大家麻煩見到咧熒幕下方咧呢個 interpretation 口譯嘅功能嘅時候咧，撳一撳選擇French 咧法文咧，其實就等於廣東話。多謝大家。Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm going to launch the interpretation, and we're going to get some interpretation videos.
Hola y bienvenidos a esta reunión. Para acceder a la función de interpretación, haga clic en el icono del globo en la parte inferior de la ventana de Zoom y selecciona el idioma que desea. Para escuchar claramente el audio de interpretación, le recomendamos que también seleccione la opción para silenciar el audio original, que es la opción más baja en el menú después de hacer clic en el icono del globo. Hola y bienvenidos a
Xin chào và cảm ơn quý vị đã tham dự buổi họp ngày hôm nay. Để truy cập vào phần thông dịch của ứng dụng Zoom, xin nhấn vào biểu tượng hình quả địa cầu ở phía dưới của màn hình và chọn ngôn ngữ theo ý muốn của quý vị. Để nghe rõ lời phiên dịch, chúng tôi khuyến khích quý vị chọn chức năng tắt âm thanh gốc nằm ở phía cuối trong phần tùy chọn của biểu tượng quả địa cầu.
您好，感谢您参加今天的会议。若需要使用 Zoom 的语言翻译，请点击 Zoom 窗口下方的地球图标，然后选择您所需要的语言。为了让您能够清楚地听到翻译语音，我们建议您选择关闭原本语音的选项。请点击地球图标后，选单上的最后一个选项。
Thank you. If you are an English speaker, you're going to need to also click on the interpretation button and select English to get into the English channel so that when a person is speaking another language, you'll get the benefit of the interpretation to hear what they're saying in English. So I'll give everyone a minute to jump into the appropriate channels. If you are having trouble with interpretation and you're not able to access it, let us know by raising your hand. I do see that we have 2 people with their hands raised already. You can leave your hand up if you have a question about interpretation. Otherwise, we are going to do Q&A at the end of our presentation. Okay.
What they're gonna say that the line so crucial.
Amy Nguyen, I see. Okay. Yeah, you were unmuted. Yeah, so we just are having issues with our muting and unmuting. So we should be able to get everyone into their right channels, and the interpreters should be able to unmute themselves. Okay. Vicenta, you have your hand up. Are you having an issue with interpretation?
No, no.
Okay.
Por equivocación lo puse.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, and David Eisbach, I assume your question is not about interpretation.
Actually, it was just why is not the chat open?
Okay. Yeah, let me tell you about that. We are keeping the chat closed during the presentation. We will open it during the Q&A portion. And we are doing this because I've gotten feedback that the chat can be a distraction to people during the presentation. So we're going to leave it off during the presentation, and then we'll turn it back on at the end of the presentation during our Q&A. Okay, let's get started. Again, if you're having issues with interpretation, you can raise your hand. Otherwise, we will just assume it's working. So let us know. We're going to open the meeting with a land acknowledgement. We, the City of San Jose Housing Department, acknowledge that San Jose sits on the ancestral lands of Native people, including the Muwekma Ohlone people and Aboriginal homeland of the Tamiya Nation. We recognize the resilience of Native culture and community. Let us acknowledge with respect all Indigenous peoples as they have stewarded this land throughout the generations and not forget the painful history of colonization. The Housing Department acknowledges this history as we work towards a more equitable and inclusive future. Thank you all for coming tonight. We're happy that you're here. We're happy that we're going to be able to talk about Copa with you all and get your feedback. I'd like to just do a quick round of introductions. My name is Elizabeth. I'm with the Housing Department. I will pass it over to Josh Ishimatsu.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Josh Ishimatsu, he, him, with the Housing Department, where I manage our policy team. And I'll pass it to Kristen.
Hi, all. I should have introduced myself earlier. I'm Kristen Clements. I'm with the Housing Department. I'm a division manager overseeing policy and commission work, and I will pass it to Heather.
Hi, I'm Heather Bromfield. I am a fellow through the partnership with Base Future with the Housing Department, and I'll pass it back to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Heather. And Kristen and Josh, we also have Mindy and Avni and Karen with us tonight from our department who are helping us out, so thank you. What we're going to go over tonight is where we are in the process of Copa and revisiting the purpose of Copa. We're going to give an overview of the draft revised framework, and the presenters will highlight areas that have been updated and changed. Our presentation should take about 45 minutes, getting us to the 7 o'clock hour, and then we should have an hour for questions and answers. And then we'll end with wrap up and next steps. Next slide. So here's where we are in the process. Back in September of 2020, the City Council approved the citywide residential anti-displacement strategy, which included specific direction to explore a Copa program. The Housing Department engaged in an extensive stakeholder and community engagement process from April 2021 to January of 2022, engaging over 500 people in 50 meetings. We had a brief pause on Copa due to capacity and moving our attention to housing element. And we revived our work on Copa in November of 2022 through February of this year and released public review of a draft revised framework. The intent is to go to Housing and Community Development Commission and City Council Committee March of this year, next month, and estimated to City Council for consideration in April. Next slide. After the conclusion of our presentation, we're going to have an opportunity to take questions, and the presenters will provide answers. We're going to enable the chat at that time, like I mentioned, so that we can collect your questions either orally or in the chat. We are going to ask that all participants exhibit respect for each other and for the speakers. And so what that can mean is we won't tolerate disrespect, which can include interpreting, interrupting, swearing, or personal attacks. And distracting side conversation not directed to the presentation content. So we thank you in advance for your participation. Next slide. And I'll pass it over to Heather.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. So we are going to start off this presentation by just bringing everyone back to the reasons why we are considering a Copa program. And so Copa is an anti-displacement policy. It is intended to prevent lower income households from becoming displaced from San Jose. And the reason that we know that this is happening in San Jose is based off of research that the Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley has conducted. This is a map that they have produced showing areas in San Jose that are either probably or definitively losing lower income households. And so their methodology basically examines where lower income households are moving out at a faster rate than when they're moving in. Displacement is an issue that is affecting areas across San Jose, as you can see from this map. And it affects people in 9 out of 10 city council districts. Additionally, it affects not only very low income renters, which to translate what very low income means into a dollar amount, very low income is currently defined as for a household of one, a household that's earning less than $59,000 a year. So it affects those households, but it also affects low income renters, which are currently defined as earning under $92,000 per year for a one-person household. According to research by the Urban Displacement Project, both categories of households are being displaced from San Jose currently. Next slide, please. So the previous map shows where in the city displacement is happening, but it does not show who displacement is happening to. And the burden of displacement is borne out unequally across different groups in San Jose. So families of color, and particularly families who are Hispanic or Latinx, families who are Vietnamese, and African-American families are disproportionately living in the areas that are affected by displacement. So what this chart is showing is that while only 13% of non-Hispanic white residents are living in areas where displacement is definitively or probably occurring, the same is true for 45% of Hispanic or Latinx families, 34% of Vietnamese families, and 30% of African-American families. So the 30% of African-American families, 30% of African-American families, and 30% of African-American families. So the 30% of African-American families, 30% of African-American families, and 30% of African-American families. So the 30% of African-American families, 30% of African-American families, and 30% of African-American families. just in noting here that, Vietnamese is indeed a category that is included under the Asian category as well, but we are breaking out Vietnamese in addition, just like the specific group, in order to show that not all groups under the Asian category are impacted by displacement equally. So it's also worth mentioning that the impact of displacement is disproportionate on different groups, not by chance, but because there are histories behind these numbers. There's a history of redlining, the historical legacy of policies that were discriminatory, and the in the uneven public investments that happened in communities of color historically. So to this day, communities that were impacted by those historical harms have lower rates of homeownership and are more likely to be living in areas that are undergoing rapid reinvestment that can price some families out. Next slide, please. So one of the many reasons that displacement is an important issue is for us to address is because many of the people who are not who are displaced are actually not able to find a home period after facing displacement. So in 2018, the Urban Displacement Project did a study of over 100 families who are at risk of displacement in Santa Clara County. Of the families who were at risk of displacement, some of them were displaced and some of them were not. This pie chart is only looking at the households that were displaced. And of those households that were displaced, 25% of them went on to experience some kind of homelessness. So there are, the popular conception of homelessness is people who are living in shelters or who might be in their car or on the street. And so that's this 5% that you're seeing in red on this screen. But in addition to that, there are additional definitions of homelessness that encompass a broader range of situations. So people who cannot find another place to live and end up couch surfing for a period of time, or end up living in a garage or in a hotel, or doubled up with family. And so, in many cases, people who end up in these situations, it's temporary and they might ultimately end up in a more, traditional definition of homelessness. But to bring this back to why this is relevant to Copa, the intent is to create policies that will prevent displacement so that people will not end up in any of these situations, and that we will be addressing the upstream factors of homelessness before people end up in long-term homelessness. Next slide, please. And behind all of these statistics, there are real stories that we here at the housing department and that other members of the community are aware of. This quote says, as a single mother with 3 sons, it is difficult to give them the stability that they deserve. We live in a 2-bedroom duplex in San Jose. We can't afford to go anywhere else with more space because it is too expensive. I worry about what would happen if the owner were to sell. We deserve to be able to have stability. So this is a quote from a family that's living in the Mayfair neighborhood. But these are the types of stories that we have heard, and that other city officials have heard, and that ultimately drove the impetus for working on a Copa program. Next slide, please. So there are many different types of affordable housing programs and strategies. One of the ones that most people are familiar with is production. So those would be any policies or strategies that involve building a new affordable housing complex from the ground up. While it's a very important strategy, and there's a lot of funding available and a full ecosystem to support this strategy, it does take 3 to 6 years. Which is one of the reasons why preservation strategies are being considered as an alternative. So preservation strategies include acquiring existing apartment buildings at fair market value and making them affordable. And these strategies have a couple of advantages. They take less time. They take about 1 to 2 years to complete. They cost 30 to 50% less than new affordable housing construction. And one other thing to note is that the ecosystem for these types of policies is still in progress, and so Copa would actually be one part of the preservation ecosystem in order to make preservation more to make it more common and easier. Next slide, please. So returning to Copa and the goals of Copa. So the goals of the policy include, as we said, preventing the displacement of lower income renters, increasing the number of homes that are permanently affordable in San Jose, empowering tenants with knowledge to participate in the acquisition process, and providing tools to support community ownership opportunities and other asset building opportunities for lower income renters. Next slide, please. And just a basic rundown of how the policy works. So affordable housing providers under Copa would receive the opportunity to make the first offer to buy apartment buildings with 2 or more units and that are not subject to an exemption before these properties are listed on the open market. So the owner retains the right to reject this offer. If the owner rejects the initial offer from an affordable housing provider, and then they subsequently receive an offer from a third-party buyer, Copa also gives the right for the affordable housing provider that made the original offer to make a final counter offer. Copa, again, does not require sellers to accept the initial offer, and it does not require sellers to accept this counter offer. So it only involves the right for the affordable housing provider to make an offer and a counter offer. Who the owner of the property sells to is ultimately determined by the owner themselves. They retain that right. Next slide, please. With this, I'll pass it to Kristen.
Thanks, Heather. Copa acknowledges that buildings that go up for sale can cause a lot of stress and disruption, as well as displacement for existing renters. When properties are sold, rents are frequently raised to the profit-oriented new buyers. This is totally understandable given that most owners are for-profits. The challenge is, however, that existing residents can be displaced even with what seems like a relatively minor rent increase to many people. This is because so many renters in our city pay so much for housing. We call them cost burdened and severely cost burdened. They may struggle with even the 5% rent increases, but definitely repeated 5% rent increases over time, for instance, very stressful and very difficult for many to afford. A purchase by a nonprofit developer would allow for these families who create the possibility that the families are already housing cost burdened. They could actually, at the beginning, have their rents right-sized to them so that they pay generally about 30% of their income for rents plus a reasonable utility allowance. And that this is, really contrasting what happens when for-profit investors take over a property. It can be very destabilizing. Next slide. So we've been asked, why shouldn't the city just put out funds for developers to acquire existing buildings and income and rent restrict them, turn them into affordable housing? Well, the answer is that Copa, we believe, is superior to just issuing funds for acquisition rehab, although the two would go hand in hand. The Copa program would address the two major challenges that affordable housing developers encounter when they are trying to preserve lower cost housing. The first is market timelines. All affordable housing financing is structured financing, which means, and there are multiple sources that the developers need to go and get money from. It might be a public source like the city, as well as a for-profit or nonprofit commercial lender, and they can get financing in different stages. So there are at least two, sometimes more. We've heard some preservation deals having as many as 6 different financing layers that they had to put together. in order to buy and rehab a property. So this is really a struggle if you're trying to make an offer with certainty on a market timeline. So, offers are going to be fair, or else who would ever sell to a given party? Copa still preserves full choice by the owner of who to sell to. But they may take a few weeks more to be able to give that accurate offer. So in addition, affordable developments might need, they cannot be pre-approved for financing. There's no pre-approval like there is in a single family mortgage context. These are all structured financing situations, and underwritten on a loan by loan basis, even for very small properties. So first, the timing. The second is the market transparency, which is there's no one listing service or place where all multifamily properties are listed, especially for those with 5 or more units. We understand from literature in the industry, they're often sold through brokerages and are not actually listed anywhere. There is no one great listing service like the MLS is for single family homes or 1 to 4 properties. So this lack of transparency doesn't mean that affordable developers wouldn't have something to purchase, but it's understandable that most purchase decisions involve looking at 5 or 10 properties before you get the right combination of price and location near potentially their other existing properties, and relatively good physical condition, or one that can be financed and rehabbed. So just having a couple of properties out there that folks can access is not sufficient, when what we're trying to do is that is to target areas that are experiencing displacement. And there could be key properties in many different neighborhoods that folks just don't have access to the listings for when they go up to sale. So those are the 2 big reasons that we think Copa could add value, as well as supporting tenants' rights to know that the property is up for sale. And we'll talk some more about that in just a minute. These issues can't be resolved through just giving additional assistance to developers, although developers, of course, are going to be hiring professionals anyway. We actually don't think that Copa would decrease the number of professionals, brokers, or realtors that would be needed in order to find and acquire buildings. And again, this is better than just the city putting out acquisition and rehabilitation funding alone, because it supports the whole system of being very intentional with our limited preservation dollars. Next slide. So we think Copa is a key component of trying to build what we are calling the ecosystem for preservation in San Jose, which is much weaker, as Heather pointed out, than, for instance, our production programs and even our tenant protection programs. We have several in place. So Copa could help fill market gaps. It could help prevent residents from having to move out, and an undesirable move. And the fact that we're preserving low-cost housing and maybe doing repairs that the previous owner could not afford to do, allows tenants to stay in the neighborhoods where they already have community ties, and also perhaps enjoy better living conditions than they had because repairs were able to be made. So as Heather said, preserving existing buildings, of course, is faster. And as we have an affordable housing crisis, we need to figure out how to get people stabilized as quickly as possible so that our problems don't get even bigger than they already are. And again, the total cost of preserving an existing building, of course, is less than building a brand new building. We all know that construction costs are very high. So, but, again, Copa is part of this ecosystem that we are building, and we can talk more about it, but the money that goes with it to enable people to make offers on buildings, and then, trying to support the capacity of more community-based organizations to do this work. Those are we call it the 3-legged stool. for preservation. Next slide. So again, as Heather said, Copa is just a process by which somebody would sell a property, but that opportunity to purchase must be supported by public subsidies and others that are lending to these kinds of affordable housing properties. There has been a movement towards making more funding available for preservation, and it's really only gained steam in the last couple of years, frankly. Both the state and the regional levels are proposing programs and running pilots that if they work, they're going to potentially put a lot more money behind in the coming 2 to 5 to 10 years. So we're really at the crest of this receiving a lot more resources. So how impactful could Copa be? Well, it really depends on how much money we are able to put towards preservation in San Jose and how much of the other people's money comes through over the next few years. But immediately, if all the city did was to put $5 million out every year, we would get maybe 10, 15 units financed. However, if that grew to both local money, regional and state of 25 or even 50 million, then you'd be looking at more. And, again, high of ongoing, we could have 300, almost 400 units a year in San Jose that are preserved and made permanently affordable, depending on the funding. Next slide. When we were proposing this program, we were looking carefully at a couple of different cities that have done similar work. And I think those of you who've come to these presentations before kind of know about these already. But DC's TOPA program, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase, it is different than what we are proposing. The timelines are much longer. But what that showed is that if you've got a right to purchase program and you put considerable dollars behind it, then a considerable number of units can be preserved. They saw over 2,000 units preserved in a 4-year span. And they also, DC is the home of many limited equity cooperatives where residents, existing tenants can buy a share into of an entity that forms and can make a purchase offer eventually when it gets financing together. So DC has that limited equity co-ops ecosystem that's grown through their TOPA program. And again, that was in the late 70s that they passed that. It's been around for decades. In San Francisco, they passed their program took effect in 2019. And because of COVID, the numbers are a little bit skewed, but San Francisco has reported like a couple months ago that they have preserved 234 units since 2019 and reported that cost reduction as well compared to new construction, of course. And that those who have been involved in the San Francisco program had said, they would get a little more volume if the timelines were slightly longer for the period where a qualified nonprofit gets to decide, do they want to make an offer on the building and then issue a letter of an intention to make an offer. So that was the finding, which is if that was slightly longer, that there would be a lot more volume under the program. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Josh and Heather to review the revised framework with a focus on the items that have changed, I guess, since November. In February, we made some more tweaks, and Josh will kick it off.
Thanks, Kristen, and thank you again, everybody, for being here. Before we get deeper into the framework's summary, I just want to quickly review where we're at. You can go ahead and click to the next slide, please. So for Copa, as Elizabeth summarized at the beginning of the presentation, we have been in the process of engaging the public through public meetings and direct meetings with key stakeholders for almost 2 years now. We've heard back and discussed this potential program with hundreds of people, including apartment owner representatives, tenant advocates, San Francisco Housing Department staff, those who work on Copa, local affordable housing developers, community development financial institutions. Those are nonprofit lenders who focus on affordable housing and nonprofit lending, and realtors, brokers, and we've also been conducting our own additional research and analysis. We last presented a draft framework in November in 2 public meetings, one online, one in person. We took the feedback from the November meetings and made some revisions. And now in 2023, we've been presenting the latest version of the city staff proposal. And this is our 4th public presentation of the new framework in 2023. So, as such, this presentation includes changes that we have made to our program proposal since November. And this has been based on public feedback, additional conversations, and additional research and analysis. In the interest of time, as everybody's been saying, we'll be spending most of our time and energy describing what has changed, and less about what we've previously presented, though we'll be presenting the entire framework. Next slide, please. So today, we'll be presenting about the following elements from our Copa proposal: applicability, so what properties are covered; timeline, so what amount of time is each step in the Copa process supposed to take; qualified nonprofit qualifications, so what types of nonprofit organizations will be certified to participate through Copa. Next slide, please. And we'll also be presenting about tenant engagement. So how might Copa support some tenant engagement empowerment? Also some items about the implementation of Copa, should it pass City Council. And finally, because of some interest expressed by attendees at the November public meetings, we've added a couple slides about home ownership. And I'll note here that on this slide, the home ownership bullet is in a pinkish purplish color. So where we've made modifications since November, and some of this actually has been since January, we'll note it verbally, but we've also highlighted the text to reinforce that these are the changes that have been made. Next slide, please. So applicability. Next slide, please. So this is the first element. So it's what types of properties that the Copa process would apply to. So these first several items on the slide are in black text. These are all items that were part of staff's previous version of Copa. So Copa would apply to the sale of all rental properties, residential rental properties, apartments with 2+ units. So anything with 2 or more units, with the following exceptions. So 2 to 4 unit properties where the owner lives in one of the units of the property as their primary residence. Any transfers to direct family members of the owner. Properties that are being sold as part of a foreclosure or bankruptcy where there's an pre-existing sort of legal process that controls the disposition of the property. Properties that have been built within the last 15 years. This would be a rolling 15-year period. So every year the eligibility would shift a little bit. Also, we've recently added exemption for a single family homes with 1 ADU, just to clarify that's not 2 units. But like if you have more than 1 ADU and this property is starting to feel more like a multifamily rental property and less like a single family home. And also we've added a medical emergency exemption where an owner of a 2 to 4 unit property might need to sell a property more quickly, where they would have significant medical expenses. Next slide, please. So timeline. Next slide. So the first stage of the Copa process is before an owner wants to put the property onto the general market. The property owner would need to provide notice of their intent to sell to the city and qualified nonprofit buyers. And then non-qualified nonprofit buyers would have 15 days to respond of whether or not would be interested and want to submit an offer. Please advance to slide 1 frame. So if no qualified nonprofit submits a letter of intent, then the property owners can take the property off to the market as owners currently do. It is anticipated that the majority of properties would follow this pathway and would not receive a letter of intent. If you could advance to slide 1 frame. So for properties that do receive a letter of intent, there would be an additional 25-day offer period where any interested not qualified nonprofit, hopefully one, would submit an offer on the property. The property owner, as Heather discussed, would be free to accept or decline these offers. The property owner doesn't, have to agree to these offers. And if the property owner doesn't agree, then they can take the property to market as owners currently would do. Please advance to slide 1 frame. So, sorry, well, this is fine, we'll stay here, but I should have said this 15-day period, this 15-day letter of intent period, initial letter of intent period, with a 25-day offer period. These first 2 rows of the chart, they're highlighted in green. So this is a total of a maximum of 40 days during which the property owner would have to wait before putting their property on market. This is the maximum amount of time. If and only if the property owner accepts the offer from a qualified nonprofit organization, there would be a 120-day closing period. So this is like the row highlighted in orange. This additional 120 days, is at the, like I said, discretion of the seller. And the 120 days, you can see in this purple pinkish color, is an increase from what was shown in the November meeting, and is based on our further conversations with community development financial institutions. So these nonprofit financial institutions, CDFIs, which specialize in lending to nonprofit organizations for affordable housing. So finally, for properties for which a qualified nonprofit submits an offer during the offer period, but is not accepted by the seller, the qualified nonprofit would have an additional opportunity to submit an additional offer 7 days before the seller enters into any contract of sale with a market buyer. As with the offer during the offer period, acceptance of this additional offer would be completely voluntary and at the seller's sole discretion. Next slide, please. So QNPs, qualified nonprofits. Next slide, please. So these are the nonprofit organizations who would be eligible to make offers on Copa properties or properties through the Copa process. And they will be certified by the housing department per the following. So the housing department staff will certify and recertify QNPs on a regular basis. QNPs must be nonprofit corporations under good standing and certified under the 501c3 of the federal tax code. QNPs will have successfully acquired and managed a minimum of 1. This was previously 3 in earlier versions of the proposals, comparable properties. This change was made from 1 down to from 1 down from 3. This change was made after talking to several nonprofit lenders and also to state and regional funders like the State of California Department of Housing and Community Development and the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, to talking to staff from these organizations. We are making our baseline eligibility under Copa to be more consistent with a lot of the, as we were discussed in the earlier slides, there's a lot of potential funding coming from the state and regional level for housing preservation. And we want to make sure that we are positioning organizations to be able to take advantage of this forthcoming funding. And then finally, because of this change, we in the earlier versions in November that we presented in November, we had this category called emerging qualified nonprofits. We've eliminated this category because it's very similar to what the current base qualifications are. And actually, I'm going to be handing over the presentation from now over to Heather. And also, I want to take just a second to apologize that I am not going to be able to hang out for the entire meeting because I have to go pick up my daughter from ballet. So I apologize, but I'm handing it over and I'm probably ducking out very soon.
All right, thanks so much, Josh. If we can go to the next slide. So just a few final pieces of the proposal for the COPA framework. One of the last pieces is the affordability restrictions. For those of you who have not attended a meeting previously, so properties that would be acquired through COPA would be targeted to serve renter families that are earning between 31 and 80% of AMI. This has not changed from previous editions of the staff proposal. To translate, AMI stands for Area Median Income, which is the standard metric of affordability in the US. To translate this into dollar terms, though, what 31 to 80% of area median income stands for, this is for a one-person household, it would be between $35,000 and $94,000 per year as their annual salary. The affordability metric increases for households of larger sizes. Staff also, this is for properties that continue to be operated as rental properties. There may be some cases where under COPA, a nonprofit housing provider, a QNP, decides to convert the property from a rental property to a home ownership property and give the existing residents an opportunity to own their homes. And in these cases, because of the higher cost associated with home ownership properties, the income ranges are higher, and they are targeted to 61 to 120% of the area median income. One other aspect of home ownership properties is that there would likely be a focus on alternative models for home ownership, like limited equity housing cooperatives, where the occupants are true owners, but they accrue equity on a more limited basis and also have a lower barrier to entry than traditional home ownership. And another possibility is community land trusts, which is another alternative ownership model. Next slide, please. On the same train of thought for home ownership, as we mentioned, so COPA can be used by a qualified nonprofit to convert an existing rental property to an ownership property for lower income residents who are already living there. They can happen through conversions to co-ops, to condos. But one thing that we have heard from an expert consultant who was hired to supply information on this topic is that it is most likely that a conversion from a rental to ownership model would happen 2 to 6 years after an initial acquisition by a QNP, rather than at the initial point of sale. However, if a qualified nonprofit acquires a property through COPA and then eventually decides that they want to resell it, they would be required to first offer the property to tenants and offer them the opportunity to purchase their units. And this is one of the strategies for encouraging homeownership that Copa would provide. Next slide, please. The supports that are provided for homeownership are to be guided by additional consultant feedback and also by a broader housing department strategy on homeownership that is under development right now. Additionally, one other document that's under development currently is a notice of funding availability, which is basically the city's announcement that there's funds available. So the notice of funding availability for housing preservation can also provide supports for homeownership, and those would be defined. The specifics of those would be defined in that document. And then finally, for those who are looking for additional information, there is a consultant memo on homeownership options under Copa that has been posted on the housing department's Copa webpage. Next slide, please. So finally, we have, second to last, tenant empowerment. This is a topic that many community members have expressed interest in, and that there's a hope that Copa would be able to support tenant empowerment. So the provisions under Copa for this, so tenants would also need to be notified of a property owner's intent to sell at the same time as QNPs are notified. The qualified nonprofits are notified. The notification letter is intended to do several things. So reduce uncertainty and dispel fears about what might happen in a property sale, help tenants to understand their rights and understand that they do not have to move. Clarify that if an acquisition by a qualified nonprofit were to happen under Copa, that they would transition to a deed restricted affordable contract rather than a traditional rental contract. And it would additionally provide information about the role of qualified nonprofits and ways of contacting qualified nonprofits if they have additional questions about a potential QNP qualified nonprofit acquisition. The reason that this has been introduced to the Copa proposal is because under San Francisco's Copa, staff there have provided feedback that in many cases it's actually tenants who they might find out that the property owner is preparing for a sale one way or the other, and often they will reach out to it is when they reach out to the city or try and reach out to an organization that can help them with the acquisition. In many cases, when qualified nonprofits know that there are interested tenants in a property, they are more likely to try and consider that property. And additionally, we've discussed this provision with the city attorney, and our understanding is that this is consistent with other laws and programs that inform tenants of the conditions of the residence that they're living in. Next slide, please. So additionally, we have a few provisions on education, enforcement, and incentives. Next slide, please. Enforcement, this has remained unchanged since previous versions of the housing department's proposal. Enforcement would be gradual. It would start with a letter and informing a property owner that they have not fulfilled their responsibilities under Copa. If additional violations of Copa occur, there could potentially be fines that are connected with other city fee schedules. Regarding the city really, the housing department really is hopes that with education and with reaching out proactively to property owners, that there would not be as much of a need for enforcement. And so if Copa were to pass in the months up to 12 months after the policy were to pass, there would be an extensive outreach process to ensure that property owners and tenants are aware of the change to the city municipal code and what Copa means for them, to really make sure that there's people are not caught off guard. And additionally, so regarding incentives, so there are incentives proposed to assist newer qualified nonprofit, or potential qualified nonprofits with existing qualified nonprofits. So these incentives, essentially for an existing qualified nonprofit that might, be willing to work with a newer organization, they would likely need incentives to be willing to do that. So ensuring that the housing department seeks to ensure that there would be program funding sources that can cover costs associated with the knowledge transfer from the more experienced affordable housing provider to the less experienced provider. Next slide, please.
Oh, just gonna have to interrupt you super quick, Heather. I just need to make a switch here and let Amy Nguyen know that I have added her to the Vietnamese interpretation channel. So if you can go ahead and join that, and then the other interpreter, Tiffany, has been texting you. So if you could coordinate with her on switching off, that would be great. Does that work for you, Amy? Okay, I see you're shaking your head. Okay, you can chat me or raise your hand if you're having issues with that. Thank you. Go ahead, Heather.
Okay. So for finally for implementation, in order to reduce the administrative burden as much as possible on property owners, the Housing Department intends to create a web platform that would allow property owners to give their notice to qualified nonprofits in a quick and easy form. It would automatically notify qualified nonprofits. And the hope is also that there would be an opt-in option for qualified nonprofits to indicate which property types they're interested in receiving notifications for. So in the event that there are no qualified nonprofits that are interested in, a specific property type, that property owner does not have to wait in order to advertise their property. They might be able to accelerate the process. So with that, I think we are, I will hand it back over to Elizabeth, who will start us kicking off the Q&A section.
Great, thank you. Well done, presenters, right on time, 7:01. So thank you all for listening and participating. We're going to go to the Q&A portion next. Let me just give you a couple of instructions on how this is going to go. If you've been at our meetings in the past, we have had trouble getting through everyone. So we're kind of trying some new things so we can get through as many people as possible. And we appreciate people who have given us feedback on this process. So we can take questions either orally or in the chat. So Heather's going to turn the chat on now so we can access the chat. And you can just start typing your questions in there. I'll pull questions from the chat and ask the presenters throughout. Also, if you want to ask your question orally, if you could just use that raise hand function at the bottom of your screen, and we can start getting through those. We are going to limit people to 2 minutes per speaker. As sometimes people have simply just want to give comments, and that's fine. We're happy to hear that, or they have questions. It doesn't matter. We're happy to hear any of that, but we do need to limit it so we can get through everyone. So we're going to start you on a timer when you start speaking. I'll gently remind you at the end of your 2 minutes to wrap it up. And then we ask that you don't engage in any back and forth. You might have a follow-up question, and that's understandable. But like I said, we're just trying to make some changes so we can get through everyone, and everyone has the benefit of hearing what other people's questions are, and that we can give everyone equal opportunity to speak. And we have maybe a smaller audience tonight, and let's say we go through a round of questions, and we don't have any more that might happen. We can take get questions again from repeat speakers. So we can do both of that. So, okay, so we're just in terms of how we, our discussion norms. Let's see, I'm just making sure I've covered everything. Yeah, we just ask that you prioritize your most important comment or questions, and that if you have additional questions, like I said, that you just rejoin the, and we ask that, again, that you don't, engage in any disrespectful behavior, such as name calling or and if we do find
Elizabeth, it looks like your
behaviors differently,
internet connectivity is.
okay. I think I'm having internet issues myself. So I'm sorry, I'm kind of cutting in and out.
No worries.
Can you
I
all?
think you were mostly audible.
Okay.
I think
Okay.
we're ready.
Okay. Sounds like we're ready. So, and I think maybe you're going to be our timer. So thanks for doing with Steve. I see you have your hand up. If you could unmute yourself, and we'll go ahead and start the timer for you.
Thank you. My name is Steve Hanley. I've been a real estate practitioner for 52 years in the city of San Jose. Just a quick comment. 65 minutes has been spent on what I consider a sales job and presentation on what the policy and the position of the housing department is, leaving only 55 minutes for public comment. I find that kind of unreasonable. Okay, during that period of time, the chat room has been closed, which is a place where people can at least comment between themselves on what's going on. I find that just unacceptable. Secondly, I'd like to ask a question as to if anyone on the housing department have any day-to-day, real-time, long-term experience in the practice of real estate, particularly in the rental housing market as a housing provider. And secondly, I'd like to make a comment on the fact that very casually, Kristen mentioned that the sale of one of these properties to a qualified nonprofit would be ultimately determined by the owner. But what she doesn't refer to is the time that the non-qualified property owner, nonprofit takes to close an escrow of 120 days doesn't necessarily mean they'll be able to close the escrow. So in reality, the time has zero value because there's no option money presented. And that's why options have value, and there's no place for an option placed in this Copa agreement, and why I think it's unconstitutional. And I'd like to ask each one of you if you could tell me why you think this may not work.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate you staying within the time. So hopefully we got your questions down, and I think Kristen will probably want to be the one to start the answer of those.
Hi, Steve. And I think we've answered your question, the first one at a previous session. Josh Ishimatsu on our team worked as a developer and property owner and head of development at a small nonprofit community-based organization for 10 years before coming to San Jose. So that's the first answer. The second point, your second point is correct.
That's not being a broker.
No,
Steve,
property developer and owner. I'm sorry, I shouldn't engage. Yeah, we're asking for no back and forth. No, he's not a broker. He was an affordable housing developer and owner that specialized in some new development and some acquiring existing buildings, owning and operating them. So I think your second question was, doesn't Copa add to the time? And isn't that something about an option? Just to clarify, the terms and conditions of deposits and when they go non-refundable and the price and all of the other kind of safety net practices that building sellers typically employ so that folks aren't wasting their time apply. This program doesn't seek to dictate any terms and conditions of sale. And then the third, I think Steve's third point was, isn't Copa adding time to the process? And the answer is yes, Copa is adding a small amount of time to the process of sale, although we did start with the actual time to close properties when we came up with the initial timeline and looked carefully as to the size of buildings and how long they took to close. Anything with structured financing looks about like we've presented. This proposed timeline might be a few days longer, depending on the size of building, but also the terms, the speed of sale, if the two parties, the seller and the buyer, agree to a different timeline, that is also totally fine. So this is trying to lay out the expectations so that it wouldn't go on and on, for instance. So I think I got all of Steve's questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Steve.
May I submit that on exchange
Steve,
transaction?
sorry, I'm just gonna have to keep us moving here so we can get through. You can,
Of
we can
course.
put you at the
Yeah,
end of the
of
queue and you can
course.
come back up. Thank you so much. Okay, let's just take the, we had a question come in the chat. I'm thinking Heather might be able to answer this one from Anil. It's asking, can you detail the sources of the regional and state funding?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So we do have information that we can definitely send over with significant detail, but just to give a broad answer now. So there are state funding sources include a recently passed foreclosure intervention housing preservation program. That's state $500 million one-time funding. There's additionally a proposed California acquisition and preservation program funding source that would be $500 million per year if passed. It is likely to, if it does not pass this year, it is, we consider it likely to occur at some point in the future. And additionally, there is the another major source of funding would be the Regional Bay Area Housing Finance Authority general obligation bonds. Those would need to be approved by voters in 2024, but that would provide a significant ongoing funding source for acquisition and rehab specifically. So it would be just for housing preservation specifically, and there would be a carve out for San Jose specifically. So those are the major regional and state sources. And again, we can provide more information over email if that's something that you'd be interested in. And I will just make a note now, because some of our questions might be submitted orally in the Q&A. If you have not already done so and you are a monolingual English speaker, just reminding everyone to hit on the bottom Zoom bar, there's a little interpretation icon. It has like a little globe, and just select English, because we do have simultaneous interpretation happening. And so if any questions come in a language other than English, you'll be able to hear the interpretation in real time if you are in the English channel. Elizabeth, I'll let you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Heather. Okay, let's go to the next person who has their hand up. David Eisbach, if you could unmute yourself, and Mindy, if you could start the timer for David, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. Last meeting last month, I think it was on the 18th, was brought up the possibility of sale. That is the possibility of a qualified nonprofit deciding to sell. What you said, and this evening as well, I just wanted to reiterate here. What you said is that if a nonprofit decides to sell this property, he must offer the property to the tenants. And if we're talking about a duplex, then they would be given the offer to buy. If they could not buy, if they were not in a position to buy, they could sell it, I believe, to another nonprofit, if my understanding is correct. And the thought about that nonprofit, obviously the 30% would have to remain. In other words, the 30% of the tenant's income would be still the rent. It's a permanent thing. What if the tenants can't buy and a nonprofit can't buy and a private person wants to buy the property? That's my question. Can the private person buy the property? Must he keep the permanent 30% on it? And if it sells, who gets the money? You've got people in there who have been tenants for a long time. Do they get a share of the purse as it sells? Does the city get some payback on this if it sells, or does it stay with the qualified nonprofit? Those are my questions. Please answer. Thank you.
Lots of good questions as always, David. So to talk about your basic scenario, if a qualified nonprofit does purchase a building today, or a year from now or whatever, and then decides to sell, yes, our proposal would be that they would offer for a certain period of time the first to the tenants who are living there, if they wanted to, for instance, form a limited equity cooperative and place a purchase offer and show that they can access financing. If they're not interested, yes, the existing affordable properties would also be subject to Copa, because the recorded restrictions, as you so rightfully observe, will continue to run with the land. And so another nonprofit would get an opportunity to buy. And I have to say that I don't think we've created a rule for how long that would have to like hang out and try to sell. Oftentimes when we hadn't really thought that through too much because it's so far in the future, but a lot of times what happens in the city with affordable properties, if somebody, for instance, if a company, for instance, wants to sell a property, one of the roles of the city can be to help identify a qualified buyer that is interested, of the affordable housing developers they work with, to buy the property. And so if this starts to sound like a workout, if someone's trying to get out of a building and no one is making an offer, they would go through the Copa process. The thing is that the restrictions would still be on there, as you observe. And excuse me, you could sell a building as restricted affordable, but you know, the next owner, whoever they are in the open market, would have to observe those restrictions too. So so they're not, and I don't think the city would approve transfer to a not qualified buyer who has never done affordable housing before. So David, I think what you are asking makes me think we should think a little bit harder about that later transaction. But today I would say that in general, if the pool of qualified nonprofits under Copa was not interested, then the city, you know, may open it to all nonprofits or potentially for-profits, but preferably nonprofits that, you know, would be interested in a given property. But you ask a good question, because you're right, those covenants remain recorded. And upon sale, you know, first obligation is to retire the loans. And so to the extent the city is a lender, or not retire, but, you know, pay down those loans as they sell from proceeds. So generally we ask for payment. It's, you know, and only very limited conditions of where we allow cash out by the developer for a particular reason.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. And thanks, David, for your question and keeping it under 2 minutes. I'm just gonna jump over to the chat, and there was a question that was submitted by Carlos. Kristen, I bet you'll have a longer institutional knowledge on this one. Carlos asked, can you review what other options were considered instead of Copa? It seems there are other simpler and less expensive options available that can help achieve the same goals.
Hi, Carlos. That's a good question. I mean, in doing preservation, the obvious alternative is just to put out money without some kind of attendant program that tries to get more properties in the hands of nonprofits that will work with the city to keep them in affordable status in perpetuity. So if you look at just that goal of trying to get more properties affordable in perpetuity, I can't remember any other anti-displacement program that accomplishes that goal. There are different preservation ideas out there, but they all involve city funds. Many involve nonprofit capacity building, as I mentioned before, just trying to get more entities that are in the business of doing this local, difficult preservation work, and really trying to increase their knowledge and their capacity to compete. So I can't think of many other off the top of my head. Really nothing else that we could think of or that we had heard of in this national learning cohort that we were part of really address that issue of getting more buildings in the hands of nonprofits as we do this preservation work.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. Let's go to our next question asker, Tamara. If you could unmute yourself and ask your question, and Mindy, if you could start the timer.
Hi there. I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation. It's been great. I've liked the changes from the last time, and I've seen like what you've improved on as far as answering. I worked for a housing co-op over here in San Jose that was federally funded. It still is federally funded, and it was established in 1971, kind of on the same basic principles. And we've been able to preserve it as affordable since 1971. And it's a co-op, you know, sometimes there are issues because, you know, kind of like management can sometimes do things. I like the fact that you guys will be evaluating the qualified nonprofits, and I believe it's a great idea. The only one thing I was gonna ask is maybe whenever you guys do your presentations, if you try or avoid using the color green, as if somebody has like color blindness, it may be hard for them to truly see what you're putting on the screen. But that's about it. Other than that, I was also hoping to get a copy of the presentation, if that was at all possible. And that's it. But thank you for everything.
Yeah, thank you, Tamara. I can answer a couple of your questions. Yes, we will make the presentation available on our website. And if you've registered for this meeting, which you have, I usually send out, and I will send out a copy of the presentation after the meeting, and very much appreciate your comments about using the color green. It's very helpful. Before I hand it over to Kristen or Heather to answer Tamara's other question, I just want to make an announcement that we're getting some feedback that we're having some inappropriate comments in the chat, and that people are directing, you know, there's kind of like side conversations going on that are disrespectful. So I'm disappointed to hear that, and I'm gonna, you know, just ask that you keep your conversation and your words kind to one another, as you know, as we're all going through this process and here together at a meeting and learning together. And if, you know, if that's not possible for you to, you know, keep your language appropriate and respectful, we will ask you to leave. So it's sort of a warning, and if we continue to get complaints, we will turn off the chat. So there's that. Kristen, would you, or Heather, I'm sorry, would you like to speak to Tamara's question?
Well, actually, I was just going to say I'd like to talk to Tamara about the co-op that she is a part of, because it's news to me. So that's very interesting, and I really appreciate your accessibility comments about the color green, and I really thank you for your reminder. I also want to say that I see in the chat that there is a competing meeting tonight for the apartment rent ordinance, and I really apologize for that. So that anyone has to make a choice between meetings. This one will be, it is being recorded and will be posted on our website. So I apologize for the conflict.
Great, thank you. Let's go to our next person in line. Gustavo, if you could unmute yourself and begin speaking, and we'll start the timer for you.
Sí, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Gustavo Flores. Pertenezco a Vecinos Activos con Somos Mayfair. Agradezco mucho el tiempo que me están dando. Antes que nada, yo quiero tomar el tiempo para agradecer a Christian, a Elizabeth, a Heather y al otro compañero por su trabajo que están haciendo para que Copa sea una ley, ya que todos sabemos que Copa no va a solucionar la crisis que vive San José, pero va a ser una base, va a ser una arma para poder combatir esto. Desafortunadamente, tenemos gente también que le interesan más los bolsillos antes que una comunidad, pero bueno, son parte de esto y también les agradecemos su presencia. Yo nomás quiero hacer mi testimonio, que Copa en realidad puede ser una gran ayuda, puesto que conozco a gente en San Francisco que ya ha estado en ese trabajo, y creo seriamente, creo que todos sabemos que en San José se vive una crisis de vivienda muy grande, y ya no podemos decir un problema, esto se llama crisis, lo que ya tenemos, y creo que Copa nuevamente no va a ser una solución, pero es una arma para combatirlo, ¿no? Entonces agradezco el trabajo que se está haciendo, y pues nuevamente ese es mi comentario que quiero dar. Mi tiempo lo cedo. Gracias, buenas tardes.
Thank you. Heather, did you have any response?
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to our next person, which is Olivia. If you could lower your hand and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. I don't have a real question. I just want to have a comment and a feedback. First of all, I want to appreciate you guys for the presentation and for all this years of engagement. I want to thank you guys for doing a great job. I know it's a lot of work. I really appreciate it. My name is Olivia. Like I said, I'm a community worker or organizer. I've been, in the community for like almost 10 years. I've seen a lot of people struggling. We have lost people, really good people that have moved out, and they're still commuting from 2 hours, 3 hours driving, it's just really sad. And like Gustavo mentioned, this is something, we're trying to do something that it's about human lives, about lives, families, not just about money, but also about families, about lives, kids, future generations. So I really appreciate you guys doing all this. And I want to remind everyone that we're in a crisis. There's people out there without homes right now, with all this cold, all this weather. There's actually people out there, trying to survive every day. And here we are, worrying about losing, the opportunity to just, do a sales within, 15 days. I am not a homeowner. I'm not a property owner. I'm not a landlord, but honestly, I don't really believe that this is going to affect landlords at all. It might affect those investors, those people that have come here to make money, those people that live here, it might affect them, but this is something that is going to help our communities and it's going to help people, human lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you for that reminder. I am just going to pull a question from the chat. I think Catherine was someone who might have jumped over to the other meeting, but earlier she had asked kind of generally, why is funding for affordable housing so complicated? And I think she had mentioned that she's unclear why there's an assumption that QMPs are going to bid on properties and they can't get funding before escrow is complete. She says, I would think it's more likely that the property inspection reveals excessive deferred maintenance that the QMP may not be prepared to invest in after purchase. Kristen, I'm wondering if you'd be able to speak to that. I think usually we'd ask Josh that type of question. But
Sure.
yeah.
I mean, a lot of existing buildings need repairs, and we know that. It's actually something that we know. We've heard from a lot of small property owners how difficult it is financially to afford significant upgrades, right? So that's actually kind of a market failure, if you will, where the city could facilitate those rehab work to be done when, otherwise it may not be able to be done. So there are programs in the world out there where actually the loans that would cover rehab would exceed 100% loan to value when you looked at all the loans stacked together. And that's really the only way that rehab can be done sometimes, because your poor condition properties aren't worth very much, right, until they get rehabbed. So it's like a chicken and egg problem. So it's that's when public lenders and nonprofit lenders are able to be much more flexible than private lenders could be and try to help solve that problem. So that said, any purchaser is going to figure out how much money they can get and then what's the best property they could buy for that money. And so that's a great example of how the city could prioritize, for instance, in a given round of funding, for folks to make offers. If a property, for instance, was on a tier 3 list and had more serious or more violations on inspection quality, that could be a targeted way to help people in that area if that property went up for sale, was to prioritize a building like that. Catherine's comment on why is affordable housing funding so crazy? I totally agree. I think most people would, that to have to assemble funding sources is extremely time consuming. And it is, we could talk about that all day long. That's about the federal government pulling back from their previous existing obligations in the 70s, gradually over the years, where they just put in a little bit now instead of, putting in most of the financing or all of the financing for public housing, as an example. That's not what we're talking about here. Was there another question? Oh, are the QMPs going to be stuck with a similar process? Yeah, affordable housing developers have to assemble sources. As Heather said, there are potentially quite a few. And so, however, no developer will make an offer on a building if they are not sure that their financing will come through. And so what that takes is for them to be comfortable with what the city's rules are about what we would prioritize for subsidy and what their existing potentially nonprofit lenders' rules are about how they underwrite. And so, they are not going to go around making specious offers that are going to fall through, or else they will no longer be a qualified nonprofit. That is something we would reevaluate and look very disfavorably upon if they were going to go back and try to get requalified.
Okay.
I think that answered it.
Yeah, thanks for shedding light on that. Let's go to our next person. Cheryl, if you could lower your hand, mute yourself, and we'll start the timer for you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just wondering about deposits. Are there any requirements for deposits to be made? Like if a nonprofit expresses an interest in the property, or if they're making an offer, or are there any requirements for some type of earnest money or any deposits or anything?
Happy to answer that. Is that your whole question? Because you still have 1.5 minutes left.
No, I will. What do you call it? I'll yield my time.
Okay.
Get back in line.
You're a professional. Thanks, Cheryl.
I could take a stab at that. Again, terms and conditions of the sale are between the two private parties. The city's not dictating anything in the way of deposits. All this is doing is seeking to change the order potentially, well, change the process a little bit for listing a property. And so, for instance, we believe that as a property is ready to get listed, or that an owner is thinking about listing it, it actually, in order to comply with Copa, that owner could go ahead and give notice while they were actually finalizing their decision, or before the property they felt like was ready to be on the open market, before they had spruced it up or repainted, or, the lobby or whatever, that Copa could be done quite early in the process and really not be all that disruptive to the seller's timeline. And then we created that exception for those people who need liquidity due to medical bills quickly, those entities, maybe not people, but owners. And so we actually created a little carve out for that situation, in which really anyone would agree that it's important to have people who can afford to pay their medical bills. So
Great.
that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. I'm going to jump over to the chat and read out a question from Sandra. I'm thinking, Heather, you might be able to help with this one. Sandra kind of proposes a hypothetical that if she owned one duplex that she does not live in, has been struggling as a housing provider, if a buyer approached her with an all cash offer and a quick close, would she lose that opportunity due to Copa timeline? And then she goes on to mention that an exemption of medical expenses is mentioned, but divorce, family crisis, mental health onsets, and or disabilities can place housing providers at risk, where time constraints may place undue burden on the provider.
Yes, I can start off responding to this, and Kristen, feel free to jump in. So if it is a duplex and it is not occupied by the owner, it's occupied by two renter families, it would be subject to Copa. These properties are, we anticipate that two to 4 unit properties are generally listed on the MLS. So generally an off market, all cash offer is not going to happen anyway, even without Copa. We recognize that that it does occasionally happen, but the data that we have available suggests that it happens in less than 5% of cases for properties that are 4 units or less. So it is very unusual nationally. But yes, those properties are, would need to wait 15 days before listing on the open market. Kristen, is there anything more that you want to add on that?
Sure, and thanks for reminding us that the MLS really does have that listing requirement. And that's one of the reasons that it's a great system, right? Because it's comprehensive. I wanted to note that a couple of items, Sandra, that you list, mental health and potentially disability, could be covered under the medical bills provision. But I appreciate you giving us more food for thought as to what a crisis for a small property owner might look like. I don't think we would do a divorce carve out, because all of those actions in a divorce are, decisions, although not always advantageous to people, that's for sure. But clearly a mental health problem, for instance, if someone's not able to work for a while and they have to hire somebody to watch their property and for them and manage it, those are the kinds of conditions under which people may want to sell and need to sell quickly. And that actually would be covered under the medical conditions in my mind.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Heather. Let's go next to Anil. You can lower your hand, unmute yourself, and we'll start a timer for you.
Hey, Kristen, I had a question for you. You used the word developer a lot. We're talking about the acquisition of existing property. So I'm curious how do you see a developer figuring into all of this?
Yeah, thanks for calling me on that, because we refer to them as affordable housing developers, which goes to show you how much we have focused on production in the past. But what I mean is an affordable housing property owner that can oversee rehab. Rehab is often more tricky to oversee, as those who've done it. It's more tricky oftentimes than new construction in terms of the unknown conditions and really trying to manage the property while you're doing a rehab. It's very difficult work sometimes. So anyway, when I say affordable developer, I mean someone who has potentially done new construction, but is capable of overseeing rehab, building acquisition, and effective ownership and management, directly or indirectly.
Thank you. And then just a follow-up to that, when we're talking about the financing that that these nonprofits are gonna seek to acquire these properties,
Yeah.
does that financing include funds for that rehab, or are you gonna, as a city, gonna provide that rehab funding?
Yeah, it's there are a couple different ways in which people could seek financing to acquire. We have been thinking of it in two steps. First, they would get an acquisition bridge loan that would be due in 3 to 5 years, and it would be taken out by longer term financing that would finance operations and rehab potentially. It is possible that somebody could acquire, and the city funds would both be long-term financing, could pay for rehab, could pay for acquisition, like all the uses would be eligible. It is possible that someone who was able to enter into a purchase agreement was able to assemble enough sources to acquire and start rehabbing much quicker. That's harder to do. But anyway, it is possible that all of that could kind of be closed at the same time, but we've been thinking about it in kind of 2 steps over a couple of different years. Does that answer your question? But yes, the city funding is in that mix.
And the city funding is not payable, it's not something that the nonprofit would have to pay back, correct?
Oh, it is. It's a loan that is due and payable upon maturity. The question is, what's the maturity? And the answer is it's way out there.
What's way out there?
Way out there for new construction. And again, like this is part of defining the underwriting guidelines for when we start to offer funding. For new construction, our loan maturities, we could pay for land acquisition for 2 to 3 years. We could pay for construction for 3 years, and then at least 55 years of operation. Oftentimes our maturities are more like 75 years or sometimes 99 years. So, and the repayment terms are flexible. Principal and interest are not due every year like a normal mortgage would be. But all of the amount, and it's simple interest, all of it would be due and payable at the end of the term.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thanks.
Thanks, Anil. Let's go to Jake. If you could lower your hand, unmute yourself.
Yeah, hey, good evening. Thanks for taking the time this evening. Couple questions and points. Just wanted to know if a qualified nonprofit would be able to acquire property off market and avoid the whole Copa process if they're able to identify something that might be a pocket listing or something from an agent. That's my first question. Second question, any type of like deed restrictions that are going to be imposed to like limit rents on the properties, will those directly align with what would be required for a welfare exemption on those same properties? Let's see here. And then I guess just, there's a lot of brokers who have been expressing concerns about how this whole process works. Is there anything, I know they can't like go hard with the listing and kind of put it up on LoopNet or whatever else they would use to advertise it, but is there anything prohibiting them from doing like a, having like a soft pocket listing and like calling people that operate properties or, own properties in the area and trying to kind of, get their listing warmed up in that meantime? Because oftentimes people spend a lot of time and effort kind of letting the local community know that something's going to come on the market before it actually does drop on the market. And then my last question is just on the timing of the preservation NOFA. I know it was mentioned during the presentation, but just generally, are you targeting this year, Q3, Q4? Any guidance there would be super helpful. Thanks so much.
I could start and then maybe Heather could add to that. Starting in the last question first, at the timing of our preservation, I'm thinking it's going to be Q3 in 2023, but our intention is to issue it this year. So that is that. You had a question about, do these units qualify for a welfare tax exemption under the Board of Equalization definition? Yes, because that definition would have to be, it was managed by a nonprofit who was making substantially significant decisions to oversee the property. And also the units were income and rent restricted at or below 80% of area median, which is low income. That is our target audience here. So yes, that is the case. Then you had two other questions. One was, could a qualified nonprofit buy a building through a pocket listing? I guess I'm not understanding that question. I think a pocket listing would only exist if Copa did not exist. So under the scenario in which Copa is proposed and approved, pocket listings will not be legal. They would be against the ordinance. So maybe you could clarify what you meant there.
Yeah, sorry. So if I'm understanding you correctly, a qualified nonprofit in the community could not purchase a property that was not listed through the Copa process. Is that correct?
Well, entities can purchase properties. I'm just saying somebody who was going to sell through a pocket listing, that would be against Copa. They'd be in violation. And I guess if I found out that one of our QNPs, who we thought were as a good actor, knowingly circumvented the program by making an offer off, before the Copa process or whatever, like it is pocket listing, I think that's a great example of grounds for not being renewed as a QNP. So.
All right, can I just, I'm interpreting the question a little bit differently, and Jake, let me know if this is wrong, but is the question, would QNPs only be able to buy properties that are listed, properties that are notified through Copa if Copa is passed? And the answer to that is they would be able to purchase properties that are eligible under Copa and also properties that are not eligible under Copa. We just think it's much more likely that the properties that are advertised via Copa, or that they're notified of via Copa, they're much more likely to go after those properties. And then I think I also interpreted from your question, and hopefully this is a correct interpretation. If a Copa was not passed, couldn't they just acquire properties through pocket listings of some kind? Like, what is preventing them from, identifying pocket listings that are not on the market formally? And I mean, the issue that nonprofits have from what we've heard in our conversations with nonprofit housing providers, and also, Josh, one of the presenters, was a housing provider himself, or a nonprofit housing provider himself, is that, there's limited capacity to, seek out preservation deals. They do use brokers, they do use agents. However, there's just only so much time that you're going to invest in seeking out properties. You're more likely to look at the ones that are on market and obvious, rather than trying to knock on doors and trying to find things that are not even being advertised, is my response to that question. Hopefully that is responding to what you were hoping to hear.
I think there's one more question to answer in his 4, and I agree with what Heather just said. And I was thinking, so for instance, a pocket listing for something that is not covered by Copa, so a building that was built 10 years ago, for instance, there's no rule that says that can't be, that has to be publicly listed somewhere. So that would be totally legal. I was just thinking of the Copa universe, but there's more than that. So, and finally, you had a question, would it be possible while the Copa process was going, I think I heard you say, if a broker could get a listing warmed up in the meantime and communicate to people that it was coming on the market. And maybe is that what your question was? Because I know we've had this question before, and I think we're open to activities that really stop short of putting something out and marketing it. But the idea about Copa is that the seller wouldn't have like 15 possibilities on their mind at the same time, that they really would have a minute to listen to someone who was going to make a fair offer. But that doesn't mean that, so like if the broker's actively marketing, there's probably a fine line between active marketing versus telling people like, I'm going to have something coming soon. Do you know what I mean? I feel like it's a slippery slope.
Yeah, I hear you, but it's also weird, I guess, sorry if I could ask a question here or clarify. If the Copa list is made public and it's public information, obviously everybody in the community would know that that property is coming to market. And yeah, I'm totally in support
Sorry,
of
that's not true, actually. It would not be available to, it would not be public information. It'd be available only to the qualified nonprofits and to the city.
Oh, got
That's
it.
right.
Okay. Interesting.
The
Okay.
owner actually lists and starts the Copa process. Yeah, that's right. So we would be using our website to help facilitate the interaction between the sellers and then giving and notifying the QMPs, but that doesn't mean that all the listings would become public necessarily. We're going to be like doing an email interface, if you will. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
We do have only about 10 minutes left, so I think we need to move on to the next question. Sorry, Elizabeth, I think I just cut you off. What you were
just saying what I was thinking.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Yeah, let's go to Norma and then Vicenta. So Norma, if you could unmute yourself.
Hola, buenas noches. Mi nombre es Norma y solo es un comentario. Yo soy de parte de Vecinos Activos de Somos Mayfair y nada más quiero darle agradecimiento y más que nada hacer hincapié que estoy agradecida porque no es que nada más la agencia y la ciudad estamos trabajando junto con la comunidad. Lo importante es que creo que todos unidos podemos hacer una diferencia y tomando en cuenta que no es que vamos a terminar con toda la comunidad con una vivienda, pero para mí lo que es algo muy lindo y muy bonito es el trabajo en comunidad, unidos todos, por un bien común para la comunidad y para una vivienda segura y digna para la misma gente que tenemos y estar con el mismo problema del desplazamiento, porque realmente es mucha gente de nuestra comunidad la que se ha tenido que ir muy lejos de aquí, que hemos perdido esos contactos y esos niños creciendo como comunidad se están apartando. Entonces, lo que queremos es eso, empezar a trabajar porque esta brecha es muy larga y es muy grande, es mucho el trabajo que se necesita, pero agradecerles que unidad todos en un bien común como comunidad podemos hacer un cambio. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Norma. Thank you for raising those points and sharing your experience. Let's go to Vicenta, if you could unmute yourself.
Sí, buenas noches. Mi nombre es Vicenta. Pertenezco a Vecinos Activos de Somos Mayfair. Quería de antemano agradecerles por el esfuerzo que están haciendo y más que nada por ayudar a la comunidad que no siga desplazándose. Yo sé que no está la solución, pero estamos todos en una misma página donde podemos ayudar a la comunidad a no seguir siendo desplazado y más que nada también para nuestros niños, porque muchos niños se han tenido que ir y son nacidos en San José. Entonces, por la falta de vivienda y por las rentas tan caras que están. Entonces, para mí es muy importante que pase esta ley para que todos podamos ser beneficiados. A lo mejor, como dice mis compañeros, a lo mejor no un 100%, pero sí podemos ayudar con algo y a lo mejor más adelante se puede implementar para seguir ayudando a nuestra comunidad. Es todo, gracias.
Great, thank you, Vicenta. Appreciate that. Let's go to one comment in the chat, and this might be our last comment and answer of the evening. So Carlos had put in the chat, getting buildings into the hands of nonprofits is not a goal and should not be. States the main goal is to stop displacement and help our tenants, and here are a few ideas they should consider. One being creating an incentive program for property owners that charge below market rents, as this would be a benefit for both the tenants and housing providers and have less turnover, reducing displacement. And two, improve current housing assistance programs such as Section 8. Maybe Heather, maybe would you want to start with this one? Or I'm sorry, Kristen, you had mentioned that you had either one. You guys are both no.
Okay, why don't I start and then Heather can join in. And I appreciate, Carlos, your thoughts about alternatives and different ways to kind of get at the similar goals to stop displacement. So I appreciate your creativity. Your first idea about an incentive for property owners to charge below market rate rents. We have tried building rehab loan programs before as an example to try to supply some much needed dollars with flexible repayment terms to smaller property owners to see if, but all of our money is kind of special purpose money. They would have to charge below market rents. They would have to do income certifications. And that's something that we are looking at again. We'd done quite a bit of it for a period of time. Then we rolled out a different program to try to help veterans, and that didn't do any volume whatsoever. But we are open to doing that as kind of a next step in how to help neighborhoods that have not seen enough investment over time. So we like that idea. It wouldn't stand in place of Copa, but we actually do like that idea and have that in our anti-displacement strategy, by the way. The second one is to increase the amount of housing vouchers. We've actually heard this from a number of places that people don't mind the Section 8 program, and even wouldn't a city tenant voucher program be even better than this federal Section 8 program? And a couple thoughts on that. One, we are advocating for more federal vouchers together with the Housing Authority of Santa Clara County. And that is actually in our anti-displacement strategy too, in our housing element. But the second concept about vouchers instead of doing a Copa acquisition rehab funding kind of combination program, we actually did a calculation about how long would the voucher kind of pay rent, that went over and above the resident's personal 30% of their income. And how much would that cost? How long, would you do that for how many years to make it equal to a one-time subsidy of helping QNP to buy a building and then restrict it, do affordability restrictions on it. And it turns out it's much more cost effective to do the one-time larger subsidy and then be flexible in repayment terms, because it only helps one household. I think it was a maximum of maybe 6 years. But for that 6-year one household, you could help multiple households for ongoing years for up to 99 years of restricted affordability when it's layered with other sources. So that would be more cost effective than just running subsidy programs for vouchers. But we're noting your interest in vouchers too, because we are as well. We just want the federal government to pay for some more. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Kristen. Heather, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I'll just add on to this. I mean, I think when we talk about, whether affordable housing should be provided through an incentive program versus, whether funding should be provided to nonprofit housing providers, we have to bear in mind that, the government's responsibility with what it does with its funds is an important consideration. And if there's an incentive program where money is flowing through to a private owner's, to ultimately fund a private owner's profit, I think there's a question mark of, is that a responsible use of government funding as opposed to funneling money to organizations that are required to reinvest whatever profits they might generate back into affordable housing and back into deed restricted housing. So I think, nonprofits are the vehicle that we have available in San Jose and in the US for ensuring that, you know, housing remains affordable and that any additional, you know, any rents that are accrued above what is necessary to pay for the property get reinvested in the property or get reinvested in the community, or, you know, reinvested in more affordable housing rather than, then becoming, you know, someone's private wealth, right? So I think it's just important to, you know, this is what we're bearing in mind as public servants here. Elizabeth, I don't know if we have, I think we're pretty much at time. I don't think it makes sense to, I don't know if we have time to answer any more questions at this point.
No, but I think we did a great job of getting through all of the questions we got in the chat, and we also received a lot of comments in the chat. And we appreciate that as well. I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I'll hand it over to Heather and Kristen in a minute just to close us out. But if we could go to the next slide, I think we have a sort of an ending slide here. I did put the post-meeting survey into the chat. If you could complete that, that's really helpful. Like I said before, we are really appreciative of your comments, especially about the processes of these meetings, and it's definitely helping us improve them. As you can see by tonight, how we were, I think, did a better job of getting through more questions and comments. So thank you for coming, for sharing, for helping us advance the thinking on this. Let me just pass it to maybe Heather. If you have anything you want to say in closing, then you could pass it to Kristen to say goodbye.
Thanks so much, everyone, for taking the time to be with us on your Monday night. I think just for everyone's, we're requesting that people fill out the survey. I'm seeing a question in the chat too regarding what date the HCDC meeting is. And so, Kristen, I believe we have settled on, is it March 16th?
I believe so, but I haven't confirmed with every commissioner yet.
Okay.
That's the tentative date.
Great. And then March 27th for the Community and Economic Development Committee. And yeah, Kristen, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, you know, by the number of comments in the chat and all the details that we covered, you know, this is a program about real estate, so the details do matter, and we appreciate you bringing up, you know, your thoughts and your questions that are constructive, and thank you for spending your Monday night with us. We do encourage you to take the survey and let us know how you think that the meeting went, and we appreciate your interest. Also, please, if you haven't already, please go to our website to sign up for our listserv, where we'll be sending out new notices about you know, the forthcoming public meetings. If we do any more if we do any more of these kinds of meetings, we would send that out that way. But we appreciate your engagement and your thoughts tonight. Thank you so much. Elizabeth?
That's it. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording.